We are picking up our devotional series, this time in Matthew. We're leaving the Psalms behind for now, picking up in Matthew 5 in the Sermon on the Mount. And we're going to take some time to just look at the Beatitudes one at a time. So this one will be picking up in Matthew 5 verses 1 and 2, all the way to verse 3. And it says that, seeing the crowds, he went up on the mountain. And when he sat down, the disciples came to him. And he opened his mouth and taught them, saying, Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. So a few things to note before we get into the Beatitudes. First of all, it says that Jesus went up onto the mountain. And when we read the book of Matthew, we have to understand that Matthew is presenting Jesus as the fulfillment of all the Old Testament pictures, prophecies, and types. So just as Jesus is the greater king from the line of David, and just as he is the better priest from the order of Melchizedek, so also Jesus is the better prophet who's raised up after Moses, who is prophesied in, I think, Deuteronomy 18. And so we see this correlation. Moses went up onto the mountain and he gave the law from Mount Sinai. So also Jesus went up onto the mountain and he's giving a new law, the laws of the kingdom. So we want to see that parallel and see the greatness of Christ as the fulfillment of all Old Testament pictures and prophecies. Everything is coming to a head now in the person and the work of Jesus Christ. And so also we see that it says, when he sat down, his disciples came to him. And so we have to ask ourselves, as the disciples of Jesus Christ, are we coming to him to hear him teach? Are we sitting at his feet, ready and waiting to hear his words? We should be earnest and eager to learn from Christ. But now we continue with the Beatitudes. Matthew chapter 5, verse 3, Jesus says, Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And we see this formula. There's the pronouncement of blessing, the quality, the characteristic, the attribute, and then the content of that blessing. So, blessed are, there is the declaration, the pronouncement of blessing. The characteristic, the attribute that we're focusing on today is the poor in spirit. And what is the content of their blessing? For theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And we see that Jesus comes and he's preaching what we could call the upside down kingdom. He's turning everything over in the religious world of the Pharisees and the religious elite. He came to undo the pride and the self-righteousness, the self-confidence of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And Jesus wants to show what true righteousness is. And that's not only true of the Beatitudes, but he's showing that in the whole Sermon on the Mount. He's saying, you have heard this is true, but what I say to you is this. And he doesn't abolish the law, but he raises the standard of the law. He says, you think you are righteous because you didn't commit murder, but you were angry and hated your brother in your heart. You think you're righteous because you didn't commit adultery, but you lusted after women. And so you're just as guilty and your heart is just as dark as if you had committed the sin. So that's what Jesus is doing. And so now we're asking, well, who's blessed? And it's not those who look the best in the temple and who have the status as being righteous and looked up to in the community. It's rather those who are poor in spirit. And so we need to ask ourselves, well, what is poverty of spirit? And simply, it is the realization, the acknowledgement, and the understanding that you have absolutely nothing to bring to God. You have nothing to offer him. There's nothing that you have to commend yourself to a holy and righteous God. All your righteousness is as filthy rags before the King of Kings, who stands in holiness. you cannot and will not ever be able to add anything to God. And when you come to this realization, you are completely undone before God. This is the example that we see in the prophet Isaiah in chapter 6, when he has the revelation of the Lord of hosts in glory. And he says, "Woe is me, for I am undone. I am an unclean man who dwells in the midst of an unclean people." And also Peter, we see that even as Jesus just tells him to cast the net on the other side, and they draw up this great catch of fish, and he says, "Depart from me, for I am a sinful man," because even that little glimpse of who Christ was, he had enough to see that Christ was a righteous, holy man, and that he was not. And he said, "Depart from me, for I am a sinful man," because sinners know when they're in the presence of the holy that they have no right to be there. And so we see this principle that blessed are the poor in spirit being played out in illustration in Luke chapter 18. And I can't say it better than Scripture. Jesus says that in Luke chapter 18, verses 9 through 14, he also told this parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and treated others with contempt. 2 men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee, standing by himself, prayed thus, "God, I thank you that I am not like other men, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I give tithes of all that I get." But the tax collector, standing far off, would not even lift his eyes to heaven, but beat his breast, saying, "God, be merciful to me, a sinner." I tell you that this man went down to his house justified rather than the other. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, but the one who humbles himself will be exalted. And so what we see here is that the sinner, the tax collector, who oppressed his own people, was the scum of society, who joined arms with the Roman forces who oppressed the Jewish people and afflicted them. Yet, Jesus said this man went down to his house justified because he knew that he had nothing to offer God. He knew that he had no righteousness of his own, so he only pled for mercy. But the Pharisee looked at himself and he looked at all of his accomplishments, his fasting, his tithing, his righteous acts, and he looked and thought that he commended himself to God by those works. And Jesus says it's the tax collector who went home justified. Why? Because he was broken. His spirit, he knew that he was impoverished and needed mercy. And so we as sinners, if we look inside of ourselves, if we look towards our own heart, all we see is deeper and deeper darkness the farther we go. And all we see is our own sin. And sin can never bring a blessing from God. It will always bring a curse. Thus, it means if we are looking to ourselves, we will only find ourselves under a curse. So the first step to find blessing is to realize that we must look outside of ourselves. We must look to another source of blessing. And the good news of the gospel is that is exactly what Christ does for us. He comes and he lives a perfect and righteous life that deserves blessing. And then he goes to the cross and he says, give me your filthy, sinful, polluted rags of your sin, and I will take them and wear them to the cross. I will suffer in your place. And here I offer you my righteous robes, and you can wear them. You can be blessed, even as I should have been blessed as the law keeper. And so this is the picture of true blessing, that we as sinners must be broken first in our spirit. We must realize our own poverty so that we look to Christ with faith and look not to give something to him as if we could add, but to receive his righteousness, to receive his perfection. And when this happens, you are on the first step to being blessed.